Thank you, Emily. I want to thank Bernie and CLGS for co-sponsoring this gathering for us today with the Palestine Solidarity Round Table. What we've been trying to do is just organically begin to create space where we can hear from Palestinian voices in the PSR community. And so we're very privileged to have Tarek Abuata join us for today's conversation. I've known Tarek for many years, and it's so a special pleasure for me to formally introduce him. Growing up in Bethlehem, Palestine, Tarek immigrated with his family to the United States during the first Intifada when he was only 11 years old. After graduating from the University of Texas Law School, Tarek started his career working for the Negotiations Support Unit in Palestine, researching legal and policy issues. Since then, Tarek worked in Hebron for 9 years as the coordinator of the Christian Peacemaker team there in Hebron, and served as the representative of Reverend Bernard Lafayette, who was a protege of Martin Luther King Jr., for 5 years, training Palestinian youth in grassroots organizing and activism. Thereafter, Abuata served 5 years as the executive director of the Friends of Sabeel North America. A queer Arab immigrant, going by the pronouns of he and him, Abuata's justice theology is centered in turning story to revolution for collective liberation. Please welcome Tarek to join us today.
Thank you all. Can you hear me fine? We're good on sound. Okay, I assume so. So my name is Tarek Abuata, and it's wonderful to be with you today. And thank you to the Center and PSR and Solidarity Group, Palestinian Group, for having me. Reverend Yoshi, as he said, we've known each other for many years, and it's an honor to be working in queer Palestinian justice work, as we had done a lot of work in strictly Palestinian in the past, but now we know that we cannot de-thread the two. And just a huge thank you to the racial justice movement of all people of color, and particularly movement for Black lives, that has enabled me to come into these different spaces with my different identities, and enabled me to do so more authentically, because the movement for Black lives has raised all people of colors and queer people, and all people jointly together in collective liberation. So shout out to them and a thank you to them. I want to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I wrote like a 3-page talk. So we can go through the 3-page talk, but I think it's really important to know who the person is who's talking to you before they talk to you. I've learned a lot during my 20 years of justice work. And one of the main lessons I learned is that in order for our prefrontal cortex to be available for reflection with anybody who's speaking, we need to put our limbic systems, our Neanderthal brain of emotional reactions to a quiet place so that we can hear each other and converse. And I say this because I've been in multiple spaces of real contention and real tensions. As was read, I grew up in that little town of Bethlehem, to a mother named Maria and a father named Joseph, who is a carpenter. That's my claim to fame. And my folks moved to the US when I was 11. And after graduating from law school, as Reverend Yoshi read, I was thinking, well, where do I want to dedicate my life to justice? And I was actually at the time working for a queer justice organization in Washington, DC. And I did an internship there. And after the internship, I actually was researching a lot of Palestinian justice issues and queer justice issues. And I felt that I would actually want to put my time into Palestine and Palestinian grassroots organizing at the time. At the time, it was bifurcated, right? It was either Palestinian justice or queer justice. It wasn't the collective liberation or the intersectionality that we are now much more aware of. We've known it in our bodies, those of us who carry multiple identities, but we didn't know how to, I didn't at least know how to articulate it. So at the time I thought, okay, let me do Palestine work. And so I embarked on 20 years, which included 5 years of doing nonviolence trainings with Bernard LaFayette, 2 college students, and then 10 years of active grassroots organizing on the ground in Hebron. If anybody has been to Hebron or knows Hebron, it is one of the most racially tense apartheid cities in the world. And so we accompanied Palestinian children going to school because they had to go through checkpoints and were harassed on their way to checkpoints with soldiers. I was part of documenting home demolitions, one after the other, during those 10 years. I was part of documenting Israeli settler attacks against my own people. And I was beaten and arrested on 5 different occasions. I was beaten. And after that 10 years of activism on the ground with my own Palestinian people, I thought I will complement that learning with doing justice work in denominations in the US. And as such, I just realized I didn't put the timer, but I'll just keep going. As such, I came back and I did 5 years with Sabeel, which is Palestinian liberation theology, and organizing with different denominations. And we were successful to work alongside 5 or 6 different denominations to pass BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, resolutions from these different denominations against Israel's occupation. And so that's been my path. I have to tell you that during those 20 years, I have gone through my ups and downs, as all of us have in our careers. And I have gone from, I've always been feisty and I continue to be feisty, but I have gone from, wanting to understand and with a lot of curiosity to being very angry, very, very angry person after I have seen what I have seen on the ground in Palestine due to Israel's occupation. And so I had to learn over the past, I would say 5 years, how to turn that anger into tough love. And it's been a journey for me. And I have failed many times, but that's where I continue to vie to be as part of God's kingdom on this earth. So that's been my journey, and that's where I come from. And with all humility, I'm in this space to share with you my reflections being a Palestinian queer individual, particularly how we deal with race and how I have seen race play out in US contexts and institutions during my time. Because I think it's really important before we support, or as we support, queer rights in Palestine, that we understand our own racism and the racist frameworks we work with in understanding queer, whether it's theology or queer rights in Palestine and anywhere else. So I'll now go to my formal talk and share with you more about what I've seen as frameworks in the United States. I have seen a lot of microcosmic racism and macrocosmic racism feeding into each other. The microcosmic part, for me, I have felt over the years, intends to bifurcate my individuality and my intersectionality as a gay Arab man. And I'll explain that a bit more with examples in a minute. The macrocosmic racism, I have seen it endeavor to set deeper foundations for that bifurcation on the micro level, and to also implement overarching racist frameworks that feed into each other and that end up really incarcerating all people of color and all peoples into legal, theological, psychological jails. The men who trained me for nonviolence, Bernard LaFayette, used to say, if a person has their foot on your neck, they can't go anywhere either. So I do this work, we all do this work, combating white supremacy, but with white people, with POC people, all people together, we do this work to confront our own oppressions, wherever they might come up. Where I've seen the microcosmic racism, what it has done to me at times is it tries to pin Tarek as a gay Palestinian man under these mostly our queer frameworks. So it starts out with the following, and I've heard this and I'll point out to how it happens. It starts with, look at how well Israel and the US treat queer people as compared to Palestinians and Arabs. The Arabs and the Palestinians beat queer people up, they use them, and they don't even have labor or marriage protections for their own queer people. And it continues as such. It continues with Tarek agrees with our frameworks and with us on his own people's lack of queer rights and their attacks on queer rights, and then spills over, and he will naturally agree with us on the methods to fight for queer rights in our ways, because we've obviously been more successful than his own people and the Arabs at gaining queer rights that benefit him. Besides divorcing all cultural contexts and means to achieving justice for queerness for Tarek and for Arab society, this method uses a de-threading method. It's a de-threading of my intersectionality, where myself as a POC uses this de-threading method at times to understand differences in my intersectionality as to unite them more strongly. But the method here is reversed. It misuses it to differentiate and divide POC's identity as to racially cleanse Tarek. And it ultimately feeds into further racist models. So that's at the micro level. At the macrocosmic side of the coin, continues to build a foundation for this racial model, or racist model, in an effort to drive a deeper wedge between Tarek's racialized makeup and queerness, as to ultimately gain control over culture and race. For example, if Tarek supports Palestinian rights and justice, and dares to understand Palestinian resistance against a 100-year occupation, then he needs to reject his sexual identity and rights, as Arab resistance includes violence against queer people as well. So it is building monoliths across cultures and across race, and de-threading my own identities in order to feed into those models. What sits behind this a lot of the times is a lot of racist thinking in people's minds. The racist thinking says his people are ultimately and inherently violent, not just in the way they have bashed gay people, including his own queerness, but in the way they resist occupation. Furthermore, this racist thinking feeds into legal, theological, and psychological frameworks that blame the society that's been under systemic and institutional violence for 100 years. We stop asking the questions, what's happening? What drives a community? What drives a community of people of color to violent resistance? In the situation in Palestine, we say consciously or unconsciously, well, they're Arab and they've been fighting for hundreds of years, it's in their blood. Or we say they are subhuman and they could never understand queer rights. Out of that thinking, we draw a theological thesis based on our limbic system's fear of Arabs and what we have been fed in the media. And Palestine, furthermore, is a very interesting case in some ways, because it repeats cycles of human suffering on multiple levels. What do I mean? Jewish victims of Western white supremacy are now using violence to harm indigenous Palestinians. So as Western society continues to repent from its violence against Jewish communities, this allows the microcosmic and the macrocosmic racism to be facilitated, to be lobbed against Palestinians and Arabs under this white supremacist framework. One example, Christian Zionism, a theology that is racist at its core, but it's supposedly helping Jewish people because they want the Jewish people to go back home But at the same time, they're attacking Judaism. It is ultimately anti-Semitic and anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab. So these systems are allowed to function because when we fail as justice communities to listen to people of color, and we continue to de-thread their identities in ways that continue to feed our racist assumptions about their own culture. The impacts on the persons, and then the impact on our continuing thinking. The impact of this framework puts me on the defensive, right? That's what it's meant to be. It creates confusion in the person of color, and it de-threads Tarek from his Palestinian Arab identity and into our queer identity. It defines Tarek as a particular queer with a lesser to no racialized history. Ultimately, it's a racialized cleansing in the same way that ethnic cleansing works. And let's be very specific here. In that framework, we can then hold Tarek responsible to any and all Palestinians and Arabs anti-queer comments. Look at the Facebook posting where one person says, for example, about this gathering, will you discuss Ahmed Tibi, who is an Arab Israeli Congress member, recent homophobic comments? My response is, it's as if I were to say to a white American queer person, will you address Trump's racism, sexism, homophobia when you give your talk about queer rights in the US? It sounds ridiculous at some level, and it's racist at another level. However, one gets away with it because the frameworks we are under is that queer is defined within this racialized system only. So it's important to reflect on these systems and not make them monolithic. It furthermore, for me, ignores that I have worked 20 years for justice for Palestinians, Muslims and Christians and Jews to live in peace and justice inside Israel and inside Palestine. And for me as a person, part of my anger over the years was that I took it personally. And I took it in a way that shut me down and put me on the defensive. So that's where I had to do a lot of cleansing and work on myself. And I came to understand that it is ultimately violence against my body and my soul as a queer and as a Palestinian person. And it endeavors to provoke violence from me as an Arab man so that it could prove and feed its own racist frameworks and beliefs about how Arabs should act. The impact on all of us, unfortunately, is that it divides justice causes, creates confusion around justice, gains control over, and throws it back into a perpetuation of the status quo against the very victims it was meant to protect, continuing racial injustices and queer injustices. Here's where I'm at, and I only feel a need always to be very blunt about this, is because when people hear me as a Palestinian, as a Palestinian queer, I know that I'm always starting from negative in their minds and in their hearts. I will say two things about where I'm at. I will not be held responsible for anyone's violence except for my own. And I will not be held accountable to any double standards in any society or any racist or any anti-queer frameworks, especially the many ones that I have not been a part of. I support Palestinian rights and Palestinian queer rights. I reject all Israeli apartheid and racist measures. I support all queer justice wherever it might be. And I reject all society's anti-queer measures, whether they are Palestinian, Israeli, or American, or wherever in the world they might be. Another thing that I came to understand is that the human mind a lot of times turns these issues into tensions and conflicts and we turn it into this competition between justices, as opposed to understanding and de-threading where is injustice and where is justice. And I just have to say that all human beings' rights are addressed in this form. And I have seen the multiple talks that came before me. This is not a competition for justice. This is a justice we do together. For a better understanding of, another reflection I've had is for a better understanding of any human society, it is good for us to reflect on our role in how injustices are implemented against that society. And I've noticed that a lot of the violent elements of the empire, the US empire society, very much tend to mirror what is happening in Palestine injustices and the reaction of the Palestinians to a 100-year occupation. And that we need to address these injustices within the empire of the day's institutions that many times lie unarticulated and lived out in individual and communal oppressions. How we stratify identity within a framework, for example, Tarek, Palestinian, queer, Christian, privileged in many ways, lighter Arab. How we stratify these identities is a revelation of where a community has reached in resisting and countering racist systems and our role in furthering collective liberation. And this is why I thanked early on the Black rights movement and all POC movements, Latinx movements, indigenous movements, for supporting all of us to work against that together. And that the understanding the microcosmic and the macrocosmic racist systems is really important when we when we hold each other's hands across oceans for queer rights in Palestine, because we open up these conversations on a much better playing field and an empowering playing field for all of us. So the question becomes is how do we push the limits of even the revolutionary justice of a queer Palestinian Christian man? And who is best able to frame that revolutionary justice? I'll just take a minute to reflect on this and then I'll wrap up. The question for me is the same question that Jesus kept asking his entire life of the empire's institutions. In a God-driven revolutionary justice framework of power, who is responsible for combating the violence within the empire, within today's US institutions and society? Because we have been negligent at best, intentional at worst, or mostly reckless in reality when it comes to injustice. The ultimate question beyond that is, who is God? Who is God so that we could love God with all our heart and love ourselves, love our neighbors? Who is able to frame revolutionary justice that is visionary and self-sustaining? So let's ask it within our own networks and institutions and organizations. Is it the donor? Is it the director? Is it the board? Is it all of us? Who holds that responsibility? So we continue this work with a queer Palestinian man who is privileged to speak English fluently. But that's just a start. And who is Christian? That's a start. My continuing answer is the prophetic revolutionaries who individually stand in the intersections of oppressions and who are communally willing to stand at its limits to jointly push the edge of welcoming the foreigner into the temple of God, not the one made in our own image, are the people who are responsible, and that includes us. So how do we all work together to understand, resist, and overcome all oppressions together? And with that, I'll wrap up. I don't know how long I went, maybe 20 minutes, but that's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tarek. At this point, Zeb is going to help us coordinate Q&A. And as Emily has requested in the chat, please put your questions in the chat to panelists. And Zeb will help us with our questions.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you so much, Tarek, again for coming and speaking with us today. It was so wonderful to be able to hear your story. just to start off a question, I was just wondering if you would want to speak to a little bit. You mentioned that the past 5 years has been the focus of your work on transforming that anger into tough love. If I may ask, could I ask, like, what was the catalyst for that change 5 years ago?
Yeah, sure. I think the catalyst is, it's not a great catalyst, to be honest with you. The catalyst was that before I was going back and forth to Palestine, and what people don't understand about trauma, people say PTSD, it's actually continuing trauma for Palestinians living in Palestine. But part of my privilege is that 5 years ago, I made the US my home, right? I was going back and forth. When I made the US my home and not live under daily occupation, I was able to have the space for trauma to flow out of my body. And it forced me into a space of, I either be depressed for the rest of my life, or I start to understand God at a deeper level. And so it beckoned a choice that I had to make for myself. And with the racial justice over the past 2 years, particularly, I know it's been decades of racial justice work, particularly over 2 years, it grew something, it drove me into a momentum of joining that movement in healthier ways.
Thank you so much for speaking to that. And apologies, I didn't realize my camera was still off. I really appreciate your sharing about that personal experience of trauma and metabolizing that trauma and being in a different physical location, being in the US as opposed to being in Palestine. I'm still waiting to see some questions from attendees in the chat as well. But I want to thank you so much for speaking to that real honesty throughout your entire talk, but especially regarding like how we can acknowledge as different subjects within and around and close to empire are different ways of being complicit. And I just wanted to ask, what are some, like when you started to bring that limbic system conversation into your speeches or different engagements that you held, how do you feel that opening in that way, appealing to like let's regulate our reptilian systems? How do you feel like that's impacted? How do you feel like that's impacted yourself or even the audiences that you share with?
Yeah, thank you, Zeb. And part of it in the past had been, with anger, we turn into negative reinforcements. And with love, we turn into positive reinforcements. And let me be very clear here to say, when I was at my church, which is mostly Black audience, like 50% and then 50% mixed, I had heard multiple comments after a Black speaker said, I understand the Black youth's anger out in the streets, and people got so offended at that. I'm like, yes, I understand it too. I've had the same anger. So the anger is a human response that we need to understand is natural. And it is unnatural for a Black person not to be angry in this country. It is unnatural, just like it's unnatural for a Palestinian living under Israeli occupation not to be angry. But the question also that the Black movement has taught me, I've seen a lot of love with that anger and taking it as fuel for more love. And so it's important that when I started reaching these new spaces, different spaces of understanding, I started to connect with people of color on a much deeper level and learn much more and understand where my privileges lie at times as well when I'm in Palestine. When I was back and forth in Palestine, I never cared to connect with queer Israeli rights groups. Some of the frameworks that Israeli queer rights groups operate with are very similar to white queer groups here in the US. There is still the racial differentiation in ways that are destructive to myself as a Palestinian queer living under occupation. I never denied my identities in Palestine or here, but I would want to do it with people who understand me. That's where I feel the safest.
Thank you so much, Tarek. It's such an honor to be able to speak with you in this way. And I'm going to start working through some of the questions that have come up in the chat. So we have a wonderful question. Also going off of the mention of the limbic systems and the regulation of that. We've got a question. Someone is wondering if you found ways in your organizing work to address those pre-rational ways of living, those like emotional, instinctual responses. How have you addressed those in your organizing?
Yeah, sure. So, I think we have to learn strategies on the audience we're speaking with, right? This is from the civil rights movement and examples. You're not going to appeal to an irrational person. When I was getting beaten in Palestine on the ground, there was nothing I could say that's going to appeal to the person to stop beating me up. They had reached that level of wanting to beat up. Okay, you wait until you're finished. Okay, that's not the strategy people are asking about here, because I hope that's not the incidence most of us want to be in. The places most of us want to be in is what is the fear behind that person's question? Because we all talk indirectly at times. I know going into a space, what's the feeling, the emotive response I'm getting after a talk. The emotive response, it's something you have to feel to put into logic to then communicate. Are you afraid that when there is affirmative action or Black people get their rights, that you're going to be sidestepped as a white person? Let's just be real here, right? Like, where do I belong? A lot of the white person in this country asking, do I belong in this system of POC's collective liberation? The response is to say, you, we all belong. And we're all doing it together. And doing it together means you need to hear and amplify the voices of the people who have been most affected. But that doesn't take away your voice from the conversation. And that doesn't mean that you're not part of the conversation and that you are part of the resistance and the fight. You are, but you sometimes need to know when to also listen for that deeper insight that comes from being POC or queer or whatever other identities.
Wow, just thank you. We have one more question. I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up today. But we've got another question from an audience member. As you've been reaching deeper into your spirituality, doing this kind of transformation and just reorienting yourself to anger as you said, a natural human emotion that lets us know when something is not right. How has your theology changed, if at all, in this work?
Sure. And so something to reflect on anger, because it feeds into the answer to your question, is this. People get, when anger is expressed, usually without, we assume it's violent. We assume in our minds violence is going to come. In a lot of these societies, like when I was dating probably my second boyfriend ever, that's when I was a teenager, they would come to my house and say, why are you Arabs always yelling all the time? We're like, we're not yelling, we're talking, we're just emotional in our expression, cultural expression. So the anger that people feel is okay. Okay, it's okay. Even if people, I tell people, let people be angry. They need to be angry. And we, instead of asking why is a person angry, we need to start asking what led a whole community to being angry. Why are Black people out demonstrating? The goal of Black people is not to continue demonstrating on the streets of the United States. The goal of Black people is to have justice within institutions and organizations and write laws and policies that are just, and to correct the past and in remuneration. So we have to flip the question on its head, and we flip our theology at the same time on its head. We love our neighbor as ourselves when we wish for that Black person to be on the same status that we are and we have enjoyed and been privileged of. Because I sometimes get away with white privilege as well. It depends. Most people are like, oh, you're Spanish, you're Latino, especially being in Texas. But I have to understand those privileges and understand what's happening. And so it very much affects the theological understanding of justice.
Wow, just thank you. I know I keep saying it over and over, but I'm just so thankful and so grateful that you were able to come and speak with us today. And I've learned so much. So just thank you for that. And I want to end with a more open-ended question. I love how you kept reiterating in your talk today about the commonalities that we face as people on this planet. Focusing on those commonalities that we share, not the things that pull us apart or the ways that people want us to pull away from each other. And I'm just wondering, going off of a question from one of the attendees today, what do you feel like brings vision to you? And I don't know if the language around vocation or call resonates with you, but if it does, or if another way of articulating that works better for you, how do you see our existence as queer people? How do you see that as a vehicle for reconciliation?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely, it has within it, the vision it has within it is the potentiality to change all systems within a culture. What do I mean? Most queer people in different societies have been the one oppressed or pushed out. At the same time, it has created, as I was wrapping up my talk, it has created the most prophetic revolutionary theology that is in line and parallel with Jesus's theology, what he has preached. So with queer people in these different societies, we have a chance to understand God and see God more clearly through queer people's resistance and love that they continue to feed into different communities, because that ultimately frames all systems work in society, as I mentioned, the theological, the legal, et cetera, et cetera. And, even in Palestine, I say, of course, as I mentioned, there is absolutely a lack of queer rights in Palestine. Most of it is, any rights that Palestinian queers have is due to omission of laws, as opposed to, justice laws. So it's really important also, as I described earlier, is never to de-thread a person's intersectionality, just as much as it is important not to de-thread a person's intersectionality. It's really just as important never to de-thread what unites people and their experiences, whether you're POC or not, because that pain at the human level is the same pain. So if it means for another person to understand my pain, I have to tell my story, as Reverend Michael Yoshi read, in order for it to become revolutionary theology, then I will do that. I was not at that place 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was at a place of saying, you have to understand Palestinian justice, or I'm going to get really angry at you, right? It wasn't, I'll tell you my story so I can relate to your pain in your heart, a model that you understand in our own Christian, Jewish, whatever, Buddhist framing of love so that we can come together. So we carry a huge potentiality for reconciliation in communities. Unfortunately, it's many years to come in some societies and some more than others.
Thank you. We have one more really excellent question from Dr. Munir Jiwa that I'll just read what he's written. Thank you so much to all who helped put together this event and to Tarek for your presentation. Could you please share experiences you have had with BDS and Palestinian Solidarity on US college campuses? As someone who has legal training, can you share why people have become so litigious about BDS? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I've spoken at multiple college campuses and also different denominational hearings, Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church, Lutheran Church. And so it's more on the denomination level than on the college campuses, but it's very similar resolutions for BDS. And so I can address both in the same thing here. So when, it's become a huge surprise to some people that BDS has become, what is a nonviolent, the only nonviolent tactic that is left for Palestinians to fight Israel's occupation with. And because it has been so effective in 10 different denominations and multiple college campuses taking up that justice cause, because we always see this justice cause within youth circles and within religious circles, the good and the bad on the religious circles as well. So because we see it there more where the momentum is driven for civil rights amongst people and for other people, at the denominational level, 10 denominations consisting of, I forgot the numbers, probably like 30 million, I think, Christians basically in those denominations. So it's effective. So that's why the opposition went to legal levels. And now we have 30 plus US states that have very different bills against boycott, divestment, sanctions. I worked with a woman who actually was sorry, actually you need to wrap up, so I need to stop here. I'll respect your time. So I think because it's been very successful that people are opposing it at this point. So thank you.
Thank you so much again, Tarek. And I will let Dr. Schlager wrap up, but I just wanted to thank you again. And it was such a lovely honor to be able to share this time with you today. So thank you for taking time out of your day to speak with us.
I appreciate you, and thanks for the facilitation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the facilitation, Jeb. At this point, we have Mr. Jacob Perez, a graduate student from Pacific School of Religion, and Professor Sharon Fenema, who are going to speak a bit about the roundtable.
Great, thank you. And Tarek, thank you for just an amazing discussion or talk, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Jacob Perez, and my pronouns are he, his. Grateful for this conversation. I just want to share briefly with you an organic roundtable that's being formed amongst students and faculty and volunteers at PSR, which is the Palestine Solidarity Round Table. And our focus is really to raise awareness at the institution here at PSR and the wider GTU body, really centering voices that are Palestinian. So this is an example of such an initiative. And so Dr. Fenema is going to be sharing an upcoming event that our roundtable is going to be hosting next week, actually. And this would be a good opportunity if you're curious, if you want to keep the conversation going, if you want to learn more or want to know how to get involved, we would welcome you all to join us. Thank you.
So I just wanted to share this event next week that we'll be hosting: Pandemic Politics, Precarious Life, and Black Palestinian Solidarity. This is on Thursday, March 18th from 3 to 4 p.m. And you're welcome to join with the members of the Roundtable and other conversation partners in this conversation about the devastating effects of the continued blockade on public health and in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially in this time of pandemic. So it'll be a conversation about what is happening in Palestine, but also how it is that we can think about being in solidarity and act in solidarity around this in particular, around COVID-19 in particular. So you're most welcome to join in that conversation. And we'll also spend some time in that conversation plotting some of a course for the roundtable. So I really invite you to come and to add your voice to the conversation about how we move forward as a roundtable and think about other events and other conversations that we want to be having within the GTU community and more broadly in our community. So please do join. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to Reverend Yoshi or myself about, or any of the student members, Jacob Perez, William Martin, and Zeb Hurst, about these roundtables.
Thank you so much, Dr. Venema. And thank you everyone for attending. First and foremost, of course, thank you again, Tarek Abuata, for an amazing talk. Thank you, Reverend Michael Yoshi and Jacob Perez and William Martin and Zebulon Hurst for helping to organize this. Thank you, Zeb, for your wonderful expertise with fielding those questions. And I invite you to go to clgs.org to see some of our upcoming events. We have a number through the end of this month. And last but not least, thank you to Emily Cardiff for helping us once again with this format. So again, thank you for attending today, and happy rest of your day, everyone. Thank you, Tarek. Thanks again, Zeb. Thank you, Reverend Yoshi.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.